Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Optimize Your Operations for Today and Tomorrow. I'm Wade Roush. I'm your host today. I'm a tech journalist and podcast producer based here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As I just said, I'll be moderating today's discussion. Now I'd like to tell you briefly about our topic today and then introduce you to our speakers. Now, if your company is in the consumer products business, you probably know that customer preferences are evolving faster than ever. You know that technology is changing the way people shop, especially since the arrival of COVID-19. You know it's getting easier for small startups to enter your market and potentially eat your lunch. And you have a nagging awareness that in order to keep up with all those changes, at some point, you're going to have to rethink the way your whole company works. In other words, you're going to need a new operating model that's more responsive to the changes happening all around you. And you're not the only one thinking about this. In 2021, MIT Sloan Management Review Connections and the team there worked with EY on a survey of 370 consumer products business leaders in 10 countries. 98% of those leaders said consumer products companies need to transform the way they operate to become more agile. And 3/4 predicted that within 5 years, their businesses will be so different that they'll be using completely different metrics to measure success. As an aside, the insights gained from the survey were enhanced by a series of interviews with consumer product executives and academics. But many consumer products companies just aren't structured in a way that makes transformation easy. In fact, it's usually just the opposite. Many companies have layers of committees that are designed to slow down change and protect turf rather than facilitate innovation. So today we're joined by two speakers who will help us understand how companies can overhaul their internal decision-making processes and become more future fit. Our first speaker is Steve Basili from EY, where he has the title of Global Consumer Products Operating Model Transformation Solution Leader. Steve is also a managing director in the EY Business Transformation and Innovation practice. He works with a broad range of clients across multiple industries to create and execute future-ready strategies for a world that is changing fast. Before working as a strategy consultant for the past 20 years, Steve had a decade-long career in the entertainment business as a studio musician on film and TV scores, and he's a 2-time Grammy-winning record producer, which I don't think any of us else can say today. Steve received an MBA from Stanford University Graduate School of Business and a bachelor's degree in piano performance from the Jacobs Music School at Indiana University, Bloomington. And then we'll hear from Parth Raval. Parth Raval is Senior Vice President and Chief Growth Officer at PepsiCo Foods North America, which includes Frito-Lay North America, Quaker Foods North America, and PepsiCo Foods Canada. In that role, Parth leads a cross-functional organization including strategy, marketplace insights, commercialization, revenue management, transformation, and governance integration. Parth and his team are responsible for setting and accelerating the company's growth agenda across functions and businesses. In his 17 years at PepsiCo, Parth has worked in many areas across the organization, including corporate strategy, global M&A, driving key strategic projects in Thailand, India, and China in strategy, and leading M&A due diligence and deal execution for acquisitions in Russia and Ukraine. Most recently, he was Senior Vice President for Corporate and Global Group Strategy and Enterprise Transformation for PepsiCo. Parth has an MBA from Harvard Business School and a bachelor's degree from Stanford, and he's one of the executives who shared their insights and experiences for the custom research report on operating model transformation that SMR Connections and EY published last fall. That report is called Becoming Future Fit, and you can download it at the MIT Sloan Management Review website, as well as from EY. So now I'd like to hand it over to our first speaker. Steve, welcome.
Thanks, Wade. Great. It's great to be here with you and Parth, especially knowing now that Parth is a fellow Stanford alum. So let's get started with some context about the imperative to change. So if we can flip to the next slide. On the left, we can see here that there are a few major macro forces reshaping our landscape, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody here today. consumer expectations and expectations of their experiences are continually being one-upped, driven mostly by other industries. And in order to provide that kind of value, companies have an extensive need to be able to leverage data and technology in new and ever-changing ways. Excuse me. Across every industry, right? This is not just about consumer products. Technology is a business strategy and a market differentiator. It's not just the operational enabler it was in the past. Sustainability is creating further tension, accelerating regulations, consumers wanting sustainability without having to pay for it, and investors wanting both ESG and financial results, and then blurring industry boundaries. This means that the food company of today could be the healthcare company of tomorrow. Retailers are becoming media players and vice versa. In the end, the company is going to be defined by the tangible and intangible value that it creates for its stakeholders, more than the sector that it hails from. So these drivers are interesting on their own, but more importantly, they're connected to one another. They're happening simultaneously and with increasing pace. The implication is that incremental efficiency gain isn't enough. CP companies need to undertake systemic change, building business model agility and operating model flexibility to enable shifting gears quickly to keep up with, and let alone stay ahead of these kinds of changes. And as Wade pointed out, our survey respondents understand that. The good news? The research showed that in response to COVID, companies mobilized. They displayed an agility that defied conventional wisdom. We heard stories of factories being retooled to produce hand sanitizer, and of companies setting up new routes to market in a matter of weeks that might have otherwise taken months or even years. Of course, the not so good news is that all of these achievements were driven by necessity, the result of determined leadership and enormously heroic efforts on the ground. This was overcoming rather than being enabled by the company's underlying operating model. So if we accept that dramatic change isn't a one-off, but rather the baseline condition that we're going to be living in, and that companies need to build nimbleness into their business and operations, then how do we do that? How do we develop and transition to an operating model that enables this kind of agility? What are you designing for, and how do you prioritize? How do you define the required capabilities and manage and measure them appropriately? And not least, how do you make this change while navigating the challenges of today? And that last point is often the biggest hurdle. 25 years ago, Clayton Christensen raised this issue in his book, The Innovator's Dilemma. Market leaders have built up enormous efficiencies and vast amounts of resources that enable incremental progress at scale. Where incumbents often lack imagination and swiftness is in disruption. We call this the Plurality Dilemma, which, yeah, it's a mouthful, but it's meant to convey that it's not just one potentially disruptive model, but the ability to simultaneously explore, test, and scale multiple business models. Given the scope of disruptive changes that we're seeing, this dynamic is more relevant today than it was when he wrote it in 1997. And what's become clear is that it's not either or, but yes and. It's essential for companies to continue to improve the current model and meet the needs and expectations of our consumers, our partners, and our shareholders. It's this core that's going to fund new innovative models, whether it's today's direct-to-consumer model, connected products and services, or the emerging value propositions in the metaverse. And by the way, I think metaverse is last year's buzzword of the year winner. But the yes and part is that many of these tech-enabled innovations are actually things that will not only provide new growth opportunities, but could help improve the core business in terms of growth potential, efficiencies, and risk mitigation. So this yes and dynamic is why the historically narrow interpretation of transformation, which is very incremental and siloed, needs to give way to a more holistic perspective and approach. And in fact, we're now seeing the word transformation itself be set aside in many corners. It's seen as too narrow for the kinds of needs that we've been exploring. So many companies are moving away from that term and standing up functions like growth offices to drive a more systemic and outcome-oriented approach to meeting the demands of tomorrow. So speaking of growth offices, this is a perfect opportunity to ask a chief growth officer himself, sitting right next to me in a virtual sense, Parth. So, Parth, I'd really love to hear your thoughts on how PepsiCo addresses the challenges of meeting the immediate needs of today while laying the foundation for tomorrow. Any lessons that you can share?
No, well, thanks, Steve. And first, let me say thank you for having me as part of the discussion today. It's a great question. This dilemma of balancing today's needs with the foundation for tomorrow. I would candidly say here at PepsiCo, we've employed a very deliberate approach to thinking about both today and tomorrow. We leverage a framework that we call the horizon logic, and we try to think about horizons 1, 2, and 3. Pretty simple. But we try to organize our time, our financial investments, and our resourcing across these horizons. And horizons are effectively time horizons. So, the short term, medium term, long term, for lack of a better, translation. It manifests in how we set our objectives every year as well, right? So if you think about how we go and operationalize this thinking, balanced thinking of H1, H2, and H3, it's very explicit in how we set our objectives every year. So the expectation is you'll be making progress against both the here and now and tomorrow. Now, the mix of horizons will vary by role and where you sit in the organization. So you just ensure that the right people are focused on the right mix of short-term, medium-term, and long-term. But that's one way that we've tried to be very deliberate and thoughtful about how we balance this ever important multiple horizon kind of approach.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's great. Really very, very helpful, and I think so important because you need to deliver value today as well as set the stage for tomorrow. So that's great. All right, so now let's moving on. When we look at large CP companies, historically they've been efficiency machines. They're built on predictability and squeezing out every last ounce of cost. Enabling agility is fundamentally different. It's structurally different in our mindsets, in our ways of working, and how we measure success. Given the dynamism of the market, as we've been talking about, and the entire value chain ecosystem, the first step in answering the question of how is to define the different dimensions that your operating model needs to support. So we've touched on the first two, from the idea of going from functional silos to integrated networks and that are outcome oriented and from single to multiple business models, but a quick rundown of the others. As talent moves from rigid functional capabilities to a blend of deep expertise and cross-functional generalists, companies are going to need to rethink capability requirements as well as how to manage them. In some cases, it may be better to outsource these skills to other organizations, which is different than many models of the past. From a controlling, slow to move and scale model to one that supports the ability to experiment, pilot, test, and scale at the speed of the market. This is very different than traditional lengthy product development life cycles, and it takes a page, frankly, from software companies. From a fixed mindset, one that's focused on optimization of what is, to a growth mindset, one not just on focus on continuing to explore new possibilities, but encourage that two-way influence and interplay between the old and the new. This is a difficult change. The old culture eats strategy for lunch saying is at play here. It takes time and concerted effort to develop muscles that foster thinking the unthinkable. It can be done though. 10 years ago, who would have believed that over the next decade, over 40% of Nike's sales would be through D2C, which is, of course, intimately connected to innovation. This whole organism of a company is being changed, which requires an ability to continually innovate at speed and scale. Innovation is more than just product R&D. It's business model innovation, process innovation, ecosystem partnership innovation, and so on. And ultimately, it's really the cumulative collection of these characteristics. If your op model enables you to effectively operate in a way outlined in the right-hand column, you'll be well organized to manage the plurality dilemma. Of course, getting from here to there across all of them, or even a few of them, is a big shift. So what do we do to make those shifts reality? At EY, our perspective is that regardless of your strategy, whether it's the direct-to-consumer focus of today or yet to be defined cross-industry solutions of tomorrow, op models will need to be built around a system of 5 integrated design elements, capabilities that underpin the ability to execute and adapt at speed and scale. So if we start at the top with dynamic ecosystems, the ecosystem encompasses all of our stakeholders throughout the end-to-end value chain. It's our suppliers and partners, consumers, customers, and competitors. And when the expectation from the consumer shifts from, say, let me buy a healthy product to help me live a healthy life, the value prop becomes amplified when an ecosystem of partners from healthcare, technology, consumer products, they work together to deliver a new solution. But even on a more basic level, ecosystems have changed how companies define their value prop and deliver value. So when we think about companies like Beyond Meat that have been able to rapidly scale up production of targeted market-specific products by orchestrating an ecosystem of third-party manufacturers, and at the same time retaining the IP of the secret sauce that delivers ultimate value to the consumer and to them. This is a great example of thinking about where to create and capture value in a new kind of ecosystem. Owning and scaling all the capabilities is giving a way to leveraging ecosystem partners in new ways. All right, my last point on ecosystems, and this is the longest one I'll be talking about, is the mantra today is about to obsess about the consumer, to put the consumer at the center. But if you think about it, to really put the consumer at the center, you need to optimize for the ecosystem, one that's more flexible, broader, and more nimble than it has been in the past, and to realize that you may play new roles within it as it evolves. If we move to digital DNA, of course, digital technologies, data, and the ability to analyze and utilize the insights that come from it is no surprise here. Not only is this the lifeblood of operational effectiveness within your organization, it's also critical to work across your ecosystem. It's essential for becoming a listening organization with true customer intimacies and have the ability to understand, anticipate, and meet the changing consumer needs. Not surprisingly, many of our survey respondents understand that data and analytics are key to their future success. And they also state that the current capabilities are inadequate and need to be addressed, which leads us to talent. While the talent challenges in data science, analytics, and technology are capturing the headlines today, when you look under the hood, the talent issues hit multiple dimensions. It's more than just a skills gap, but it's also in how to attract, manage, and keep a talent pool that is A, very different compositionally from a traditional model, and B, designed to operate differently, adapting and flexing at the speed of the market. So it's not just about competing for talent, but rethinking how we deploy and manage it. With innovation platforms, when we think about managing an effective innovation platform, there are 2 key dimensions. Number one, it's the tools and processes and governance construct that fosters a broader set of innovations, like I mentioned before, product, business model, process, and so on. And then number 2, it's a cultural shift. It's about going beyond brand and product line extensions, and instead continually thinking about what customers are going to need in 5 to 10 years, and what needs they need to put in place, what needs to be put in place now in order to get there. So this means going beyond the R&D group for innovation. The ideas that need to be nurtured often can come from all corners. And with digital tools and communities, we can enable this broader scope of innovation, whether it's through analytics or through human creativity. We can capture and take action on insights from the manufacturing shop floor or from customer service, which is often where a lot of great ideas lie unexplored. And then we can add innovation that originates outside our 4 walls. And a perfect example of that is Lego, when we think about how they've crowdsourced new product designs from their million-strong online community. And then the last one is enduring purpose. Sustainability and purpose emerged as key value drivers in the survey. So when we think of companies like Nike and Ben & Jerry's and how they've developed reputations for not just differentiated purposes, but for walking the talk, by taking bold and sometimes controversial positions on key topics. While those companies in those examples might be at the far end of the spectrum, almost 80% of the respondents said incorporating ESG and sustainability into their business is essential to future success. Yet at this point, only about half said sustainability is embedded into their business decisions and operations. And this is where the next horizon for purpose in ESG is. It's going to go beyond companies demonstrating their positive impact, and it's going to be about how they can operationalize their principles and commitments into everyday running of their business. So the last point about these design elements is that it's a system. These aren't silos, but they need to be really considered as a totality. I've found in practice that these elements, addressed in concert with one another, help create a roadmap for successfully defining and executing a systemic transformation, one that enables you to leap beyond the incremental. And so with that, we're going to close out this portion by, we'd like to hear your thoughts. We have a poll question set up around these 5 design elements, and we'd like you to select what you think the 2 design elements are that your organization has the biggest gaps relative to tomorrow's demands. And when the poll comes, you can ignore those specific instructions on the screen. I mean, we're asking you to select 2, so you will be able to select 2 of them. So why don't we take about 30 seconds or so to do that now, and then we'll take a look at the results. So while we're filling this out, I'll just say that when we often run future scenario-based innovation workshops, we'll ask this question after people have had the opportunity to play around in a range of future scenarios and think about the requirements of the future. And so it'll be interesting to see how the results from today's poll compare against what we've seen in client workshops. Okay, so this is very interesting, right? We see, so I'll just quickly read through them. So dynamic ecosystems at 44%, digital DNA at 37%, talent flexibility 48%, innovation platform 41%, and enduring purpose at 18%. So it's a pretty even split amongst those top 4, and this does comport nicely with what we often hear from clients in our workshop settings. Usually the 2 elevate above the others, talent flexibility and digital DNA, and then the secondary one would be talent flexibility and ecosystems. So this is, for me, it's instructive because not only are these, this comes back to the idea of a system, not only are these all needing to be addressed, they'll be best addressed when looked at together because they all interface with one another. Great. All right. So I think I am finished up with my section, and I'm going to hand it off to Parth to tell us all about what he's leading at PepsiCo. Parth.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks again for having me here. I thought it'd be great just to first ground everyone on a little bit about PepsiCo Foods North America. We're obviously a big sector within the PepsiCo organization, and we're blessed to have some iconic brands. We're in nearly 98% of households across America, with 7 trademarks that generate over $1 billion in sales, and drive growth for our retail partners. And I mention this because it's a really good context to help frame a little bit of that transformation and that journey that Steve very eloquently described on being able to make the leap to become more nimble when you have a dominant and very sort of strong position in the marketplace. So as we turn to the next slide, you'll see that this complex market that we're in is requiring faster and tighter coordination more than ever before. As we look at our business, the consumer, starting with the consumer, we're really having to get into a lot of additional spaces. The consumer is leading us into new substrates, new packaging, and honestly, preferences that are evolving, taste preferences that are evolving more rapidly than ever. On top of this, you've got business models that have to evolve. We've got a retail landscape that is evolving dramatically, and the pandemic has only accelerated some of these elements with respect to hard discounters and the rise of e-convenience coming out of the pandemic with GoPuffed and Instacart, as you see on the page. Of course, a lot of new entrants into the market also mean that we have to take a really thoughtful approach as we think about the business model and what it will take to drive competitive advantage going forward. To keep winning, we need to really essentially drive that speed and agility that Steve referenced. We need to have very clear priorities that are wired through the organization. We then need to obviously put resources against those priorities and be able to drive decisions faster than ever. This requires coordination across the obvious vectors of functions and geographies and businesses, but it also requires a coordination across different capability levels in the organization and even baseline priorities that tend to vary across functions and groups. How do you bring this all together? So why don't we actually hear a little bit from you all? If we can turn the slide here, when you think about your organization, what are the strategic and operational challenges that you feel your business is facing today? You think about new channels, you think about changing consumer preferences that your organizations might be up against. Supply chain issues are very topical in the current sort of context. Sustainability, as Steve also mentioned, remains at the forefront for our industry and for our organizations at large. And then, of course, the talent and labor situation and market we're in right now is unprecedented. So why don't we take a few minutes and understand what's on your mind and understand what are the challenges that you all are trying to solve for today. We'll give this about 30 to 40 seconds for you all to pull in and log your votes and perspective. So it looks like nearly half of you are citing business models and new channels as essentially the foremost challenge that your company is facing today, followed pretty closely by the consumer and supply chain. And then look, and no surprise here, the number one takeaway here is talent and labor. You know, it's interesting when you look across these five. You know, this resonates very strongly with the way we would think about the world as well, and just actually underscores how different each of these challenges candidly are, and how it requires bringing the system together to solve for some of these challenges, because it's end to end. It truly is across the entire organization. So with that, let's give you a sense of how we think about it here at PepsiCo Foods North America. About a year ago, we established the growth office at Frito-Lay within PepsiCo Foods. And while PepsiCo Foods and Frito-Lay North America have always operated with a sense of urgency, we've realized, given some of those challenges that we've just talked about, that we really needed to step change our approach. Our growth ambition is accelerating, our priorities are growing more complex and nuanced than ever, and the capabilities we need to deliver this agenda are growing more demanding and more nuanced across portfolio, execution, and precision of execution, and our sustainability goals. So how do we do it all? How do we adopt and adapt an operating model that's going to ensure that we manage this weave of governance across functions thoroughly and with the same agility? So on the next slide, you'll see how we've thought about this. In the PepsiCo Foods North America Growth Office, we are essentially accomplishing this through a very deliberate design and remits of 5 different towers that we have across the organization. We are focused first and foremost on setting the strategy. So the strategy and marketplace insights tower looks deeply and spends a ton of time at looking and examining the competitive landscape, channels, etc., and where the consumer is going, candidly. Next in the design of our growth office is the portfolio strategy and aligning the tactics and execution. This is where the commercial tower really plays across our field teams, our brand teams, and our customer teams. Increasingly, we find that the need for revenue growth management is a key commercial capability that needs to be in lockstep with how we align the tactics. It's a critical enabler for driving growth across most of CPG. All of this is supported by a transformation team that drives that Horizon 3 thinking that I referenced earlier across the digital and value chain change agenda. And our transformation management office essentially brings this all together. It manages this portfolio of projects, resourcing, benefits realization, etc. Now, this structure has to be supported with the right governance as well, the right governance mechanism. And so we have a very steady drumbeat in the growth office where we review projects, initiatives on a weekly basis. And this really helps to drive organizational agility, which I'll talk about next. On this page, you see, we bring the system together in the room every week, candidly. We have our field sales teams, we have our customer sales teams, the supply chain and marketing all together, discussing, interrogating, and pressure testing different ideas. We hear from all different functional stakeholders to understand what their perspective on any particular opportunity might be. And the culture of speed and transparency is what's underpinning the growth office. As the Chief Growth Officer for PepsiCo Foods North America, it's my responsibility to hear end to end what each of the functional considerations are and to help shepherd through different ideas and different commercial opportunities through a very collective and comprehensive discussion, ensuring that we're remaining functionally agnostic, but in line with what our business priorities are. This is driving real results, as you'll see on the following page here. As we've stepped into 2021 and 2022 with the growth office, we're driving some real benefits and impact at retail. Some of our big bet innovation across the organization, which historically would have been very onerous to get through each functional committee and review, is now commercialized end to end to ensure that we're driving the best impact at retail, but ensuring that we've really linked together across all the different components of the value chain to make that happen. I'll also highlight here notions of being able to collaborate across both Frito-Lay and Quaker Foods with cross-docks at retail that bring together two different parts of our organization. And finally, I'll highlight snacks.com. You know, the omni-channel environment is accelerating, and we were able to stand up snacks.com very quickly within PFNA, and we're really learning and having a direct relationship with our consumers that's going to be invaluable as we think about innovation going forward. So with that, let me turn over to our Q&A session. I think we're right at that session here to take questions from the audience.
Fantastic. Thank you, Parth, and thank you, Steve. We are doing great for time, and it is now time for the Q&A portion of the webinar. We have some questions coming in from the audience, and we'll continue to take those. You can submit them using the questions module in the GoToWebinar control panel. And I'm going to start off with a couple of questions from myself for Steve and Parth. The first question I have is for Steve, I guess. I'm wondering, with the kind of systemic change that you're calling for, how do companies typically get started? You outlined a lot of different steps.
Yeah.
What's the one to focus on first?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Well, let me preface it. Start off by saying, you know, I think the companies that I've seen do this well bring a mindset of continually challenging their orthodoxies, right? Because an agile organization is a reflection of a collection of agile minds. And so the starting point a lot of companies take is they start in the future. They do things like scenario planning to break their mental models and explore what the future may look like and why. And then they play around with what's going to drive value in a world that's going to look different from today. You know, I often say that, you know, people tend to think the future is an extrapolation of the past plus or minus 10%, but that's never the case. And so we need to constantly challenge ourselves that way. So that's generally a great starting point, because then everything can cascade from that: the strategies, the capability requirements, architecture of the transformation process, and so on. And another key thing to think of is, you know, people think scenarios are just in the realm of enterprise strategy, but I've seen it applied just as successfully at the BU level or the functional level or around particular issues such as direct to consumer. So, you know, while those are starting points, tangible starting points, at the root, it's about bringing a different mindset and set of tools to bear in defining where you want to go and how to get there.
Okay, great. A question for Parth. So you told us a little bit about the growth office that you set up inside Frito-Lay North America. It sounds like you've been at that for about 1 year now. So
That's
I'm
right.
wondering, yeah, what's What are you learning? What's the big takeaway? Any big surprises? Any big learnings so far?
No, it's a great question. Honestly, we're operating in probably the most VUCA of all environments ever imaginable. So
Define VUCA for us.
yeah, volatile, uncertain, changing, ambiguous,
Yeah.
all of those things kind of happening in an unprecedented way. And we're learning stuff all the time. But what I would tell you as I reflect on 2021, there's two things that really, really stand out. I think number one is this power of systems thinking. Okay, so typically when we're trying to go get things done in a big organization, an idea will originate in the marketing organization, or perhaps in the sales organization, or in a function. And it gets championed or heralded kind of through the organization by a key stakeholder, et cetera. And there will be dissenters, and there will be the silent kind of, pocket vetoes that exist kind of, lurking under the surface. But when you bring the system together and you deliberate, you debate, you interrogate, you pressure test, there's something magical that happens there. People feel like they're part of the solution, and you actually get to a better solution that any one function left to its own sort of siloed view of the world would not have arrived at. And so that's number one. Number two, and Steve, you're spot on. This notion of optionality is just really important right now. So at the growth office, we're constantly thinking, what's plan B? In fact, what's plan C, in some instances, because inevitably things are going to shift on us, and, we're going to have some assumption change. And so we have to think about those trade-offs in a really meaningful way and understand how we can course correct in real time. And this is on the here and now, and it's also, indicative and important for, the longer term thinking.
Okay, great. So thanks for each of you for responding to my questions. Now I'm going to go to the audience questions we have coming in and kind of try to translate those and pass them along to you. So, okay, we have a question coming in from Shelby in the audience. This is for Steve. Steve, you mentioned scenario planning. Can you give an example of how you use scenario planning or future thinking to inform operating model requirements?
Yeah, sure. Here's okay. So here's a story where we're working with an agribusiness client, and essentially what they wanted to do. The original question was around, frankly, something like it was the buy to pay process or order to cash, and but they said, we need to update our order to cash process, but we want to make sure that we're set up for where agriculture is going to be in the future, right? Because if we spend a couple years, fixing this for today, things might be changing by the time we actually go online. So we use scenarios to imagine the future of agriculture and what's that going to be. So we looked at all the different what's going on societally and environmentally, economically, with regulations and so on, to paint that picture. And what that did was that helped us to not only think about directionally where to go, where the company needs to go for a future that's going to look different from today, and then we were able to rethink how the functions operate together, the kinds of expectations that farmers and dealers and everybody throughout the value chain was going to be working, and how to deliver against that. And then rethink the design of the operating model and the organizational structure and the process flows to be able to deliver that. And so it was a fundamentally different model than the company's existing processes and model. And actually what it did is it actually filtered up through the organization, and it started to affect the commercial strategy and come up with new kinds of models and revenue models and business models that the company could employ to anticipate and meet the needs of the future farmer.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great example. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to pass along a question from Seth. This is for Parth, and it's about ESG, environment, sustainability, and governance. So Are you able to assign an ROI to your ESG initiatives, and how do you rank those when you're trying to figure out how to transform your business model?
No, it's critical, and it's a great question, Seth. Thank you for the question. At PepsiCo, we've become a lot more surgical in doing exactly this, right? Being able to go make the transition from stated goals to now understand what are the implications through the value chain in terms of both cost and benefit, right? And so while this organization sits corporately, it's actually not within our growth office here. We are actually now building models and actual tools to assess exactly this, and to be able to say that we're going to have to really take this as an industry, and back to kind of that notion of an ecosystem of partners that needs to kind of go help drive and improve ROI on ESG goals. You can't do it alone, and nor should you. This is an industry, broader imperative. And so, yeah, it's a great question. We've published our kind of first ESG reports, where now we're getting a lot more surgical and empirical, and we're just getting started. And so as this continues, you'll see more from, I think more from us and several other organizations in this space.
Okay, on this ESG question, we have another inquiry coming in from Maria, who says it surprised her that the purpose issue and the ESG sustainability issue were in that poll question that we gave. That was not perceived as much of a gap as some of the other areas. There was less of a gap in ESG than in the other areas, and that was surprising. Do you have any? Can you speculate on why that?
I'm speculating to your point, Wade, but I would contend that, candidly, if you just look at kind of the point in time we're at, okay, that there is a broad-based challenge right now with talent and labor and global supply chains. And had you taken this perhaps 2 years ago, or perhaps 2 years from now, I would suspect that the percentages would look a little different. So, Maria, that's kindly what I would say. I don't think it's any less important. It's just a great example of Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3, right? What's kind of immediately in front of us versus the long-term balanced focus that we need to maintain and ensure that we have an eye on in the broader kind of scheme of things.
Yeah. Well, okay. So speaking of employee and talent shortages, we have a question coming in from Krista. She'd like to ask both of you what you see companies doing about the lack of employee flexibility or the demand for more flexibility and labor shortages in general. What are you doing at PepsiCo, Parth, and what do you see companies doing more broadly? Steve?
Steve, you want to start, and I'll build?
Oh, I thought it was going to be the other way around, Parth, but yeah, okay, that's fine. So I think we're seeing a few different things, right? One is reaching out to the ecosystem, right? And in terms of like talent shortages, in the sense of it's hard to get the talent. It's actually costly. I mean, let's face it, and that many of the talent challenges that we have is around digital data analytics and so on, and many of that kind of talent are not clamoring to join CP companies, so they're looking to go join Google or something like that. And so trying to acquire that talent can be costly and slow. So leverage the ecosystem, because that allows you to flex and scale the talent needs as required. With regard to flexibility and new kinds of models, this is all being done in real time. And so, companies are grappling with how to allow for the people's, we've all been struggling through this COVID period, right? And so, on the one hand, companies are trying to provide that flexibility, and they're looking for ways to do it, whether it's through, flex hours or, or certainly there's the whole work from home piece, but I think the wall they're butting up against is that we're all hitting, it's hard to turn off the clock. It's hard to get away from work because we're all living it. I don't call it work from home. I call it living at the office. And so what companies are trying to do to address that challenge at the moment is through providing unlimited vacation, trying to create new day, take Fridays off, those kinds of things. But those are band-aids at this point in time. I don't think the answer has been found yet.
Just to kind of add to that, what I would say, Wade and Steve, is, from our perspective, we bifurcate the problem or the into kind of professional staff and our frontline. Because obviously at PepsiCo we have a big frontline organization. The challenges are different. The frontline exists in the real world and is out and about every single day. I think it gets back to some of this in the short term. Yes, you've got some of the tactics that Steve talked about, but in the longer term, it requires the premise of this discussion, a business model innovation that says, how do you design jobs in a way that actually are compatible with the flexibility that people are looking for? It requires quarter turns on the way we've always done things. And, candidly, that's not easy. It touches, people's livelihood. It touches the day in, day out sort of drumbeat of most organizations. But there's a way to make it work. It requires, really deliberate analysis on top of understanding how a tweak to jobs will manifest in sort of the business imperatives that you've got to go execute. On the professional side, we're kind of in the same sort of test and learn kind of phase, if you will, that Steve referenced, right? I don't think there's a silver bullet to this. And we're going to be flexible, right? We're going to have to find our way into this a little bit. So, if anybody's got that silver bullet, I'm all ears. So
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Wade, can I just add one more thought on that one? Because I think it's a really critical one. And I'm going to leverage Parth's, 3-horizon model here for just a moment. And that is, in addition to the challenges that, that are facing us immediately, when we think about, what's kind of evolving over time, the nature of the workforce is going to change, because now your employees really are your full-time employees, your gig employees, and your bots. And so what is that model going to look like moving forward? And that has to be taken into account as we are thinking about what we do today to solve, the immediate needs with today's band-aids.
Okay. Great. I've got a trio of questions. They're all kind of for Parth, and you can probably answer them in fairly rapid manner, but they all have to do with the structure of the growth office and what you're trying to do there. So one is, you're working inside of a large organization. You're trying to motivate a large organization, but you're part of an even larger organization, right? So do you have to require approval from higher authorities like PepsiCo's CEO or its board to get done what you want to get done?
Honestly, we've got a fairly good and streamlined structure within our sector, right? So I sit on the executive committee of the sector, reporting to the CEO of PepsiCo Foods North America. And, of course, there's materiality thresholds that every organization will have. Certain things would have to go, for corporate approvals, et cetera. And so that apparatus exists. But what we've really tried to do in the growth office and in the sector at large is to empower teams to go get things done fast, right? So, as you think about, let's not let the governance mechanisms get in the way of moving the agenda forward. And so I would say, candidly, we also, in that same breath, ensure that lower in the organization, people are empowered to go make certain decisions, so that it isn't the case that everything is floating up, right? And there are, it's empowering for our teams as well, back to your point on kind of motivating folks to feel like they can act as an owner and truly go get things done, right? So it's working quite well.
Okay. Well, when you're trying to manage and promote rapid change, we have a question from Shane about how do you do that for the parts of the organization that are probably less flexible than anybody else? So like manufacturing, packaging, like the ones
Yeah.
with a lot of built environment already in place. How do you
Yeah.
help them change quickly?
No, again, that's an awesome question. We have to work within our bounds, and that is candidly a challenge we're all facing right now. Not only kind of a fixed base, but the challenges to that fixed base, right? So that's where kind of optionality, scenario planning becomes super important, right? To say within what we can go do, within our constrained environment where there are constraints or trade-offs to be made, what can we go do? At the same time, let's take that manufacturing example. Let's ensure we've got people thinking about the art of the possible, right? And so it's not today. That's a bet, the small sort of piece of work that's going to pay dividends 2-3 years from now. But there is a set of individuals who are ring fenced to think about that, because otherwise the day to day will sort of dominate and you will be really just consumed and not drive that agility and flexibility over time.
Okay. And thirdly, from Diane, we have a question about, well, who's assigned to think about what? Do you have different people focusing on different goals, like Horizon 1 versus Horizon 3?
We do. It's a great question that I referenced it a little bit, but let me expand a bit. Our strategy vertical within the growth office is by definition and by design most focused on Horizon 3, helping us see around the bend. They are externally oriented and then bring some of that insight back into the organization. The commercial organization, again, by design, is very Horizon 1 focused. We have to focus on getting product to market, along a critical path in a particular quarter or half or year. And so it's about ensuring that folks are allocating their time against the right priorities based on their remit. Now, I will also say one of the things I'm encouraging, if the strategy team was spending, call it 80% of its time on H3, they should also have a 20% appreciation on what's happening in the business today, so that the H3 strategy is consistent, internally consistent and palatable, and vice versa. The commercial team should also be thinking about the future.
Okay. Okay, this is a question I'd love to hear from both of you about this one. It has to do with partnerships and ecosystems. So do you have favorite examples of, Steve, of companies that you've worked with, or Parth, divisions within PepsiCo, where you went beyond the traditional value chain partnership, and figured out something brand new in terms of the way you work with outside partners?
Yeah, I mean, I can give a high level example of of technology partners. As we think about our transformation agenda, we've got a host of partners we work with in the industry at large who have expertise in building certain tools and capabilities that are digital forward. And some of that capability is new to enterprise for a lot of big CPGs. I think that's the most salient one that comes to mind, and you realize, hey, a partner can design a particular tool or capability with efficiency and effectiveness at a way that perhaps within the enterprise would be better served by having a partner. So that's the one that really kind of comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. Steve, do you have any favorite examples?
Sure, and I have to be careful and disguise this, and so apologies if some of it might be a little oblique, but working with a client that was it was a business reinvention kind of an exercise, and they decided one of the things they were going to do, they had particular capabilities around track and trace and tracking the sustainability through the end-to-end ecosystem across agriculture, and this is a different company, and they decided they wanted to get closer to the consumer, especially in the African and the Asian markets, and global company, and so they were standing up new business lines, and so they had plenty of your traditional kinds of relationships, in terms of the traditional value chain, but it was really about developing relationships with NGOs, developing relationships with new technology companies in ways that they hadn't developed relationships before, so that they could scale their particular technology and apply it in a new kind of way. And there were others like that. And so it really required them to not only rethink what their talent requirements were to be able to do that, and in terms of like, who can manage those kinds of relationships, but then how does that tie in with the core business? And so by doing those kinds of partnerships, it enabled them to expand their pie. And the irony of it is it goes back to that yin yang symbol, is many of those relationships that they developed actually helped improve what they were doing in terms of their core business.
Okay. I'm going to ask you each I'm going to ask you a lightning round question that I'd like to ask you to answer in a minute or less. So should be easy for you since we've been thinking and talking and writing about this for a while now. So what's the one thing consumer products companies need to know about successfully transforming their business model operations? So it's the one thing question. Parth, do you want to go first?
The one thing, okay, just one, right? Okay, so honestly, I would say let the consumer lead the way, and inform when, where, and how, and candidly to what extent you transform your operating model, right? I think it's easy for us to, in big organizations, lose sight of the consumer, and the consumer will ultimately vote with their pocketbook, their pantry, etc. And as they lead the way, it should inform how we transform our operating models accordingly. So that's the one thing I would say, Wade.
Okay, that's a great one. Steve, I'll let you have the closing word.
Oh, thanks. So Parth, you stole my start outside in line, but that's I mean, so I'm just reinforcing Parth's point about start with the consumer. Yeah, I guess the one thing to realize is that this is a journey. There's no silver bullet. One size doesn't fit all, and many traditional tools that help us, make ourselves more efficient, benchmarks and things like that, are great. You still need to use those, but those aren't going to provide the answer when you're creating a new future. So if our operating model needs to help us move faster and change directions more easily and make smarter use of data and deploy our talent in a new way, we need to be bold and trust the courage of our convictions and be willing to think the unthinkable.
Think the unthinkable. That's a great place to end. This has been really fun, guys. We're out of time now, but I want to thank you both for joining us, Steve Basili and Parth Raval. And thank you to our audience today. A final thank you to EY for sponsoring and presenting at today's webinar. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe. Have a great weekend. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Wade. Thanks, Parth.